Let's dive into the scandalous true stories of 6 historical titans who met their gruesome end thanks to the French pox. We tend to look back at our heroes through rose-tinted glasses, don't we? We idolise the great thinkers, the power-hungry leaders, and the artistic savants. Their biographies arrive in our classrooms polished to a shine, looking perfect, but let's be real, they are missing the most important gritty details. If you peel back the layers of those carefully curated legends, you will find a nasty little secret that historians and biographers have been sweeping under the rug for generations. It is the story of a ravaging ancient infection that quietly ate away at the grey matter of some of the most brilliant icons the world has ever known. According to medical historians digging through the archives in 2026, syphilis was basically the unspoken plague of the high society, set a dirty little secret among the elite. Long before we had penicillin to save the day, this wasn't just some rare affliction. It was absolutely rampant, tearing through the aristocracy and the creative communities like wildfire. However, the shame attached to the condition was so intense that doctors would lie on official documents, falsifying death certificates and burning records just to keep a famous family's reputation from hitting the gutter. This centuries-long conspiracy of silence has successfully obscured one of the most tragic and recurring patterns in our history books. We watched massive icons fall apart in the public eye, and everyone was quick to blame the booze or just write it off as the bizarre eccentricity of an artist. But the real villain, pulling the strings from the shadows, was the catastrophic neurological decay caused by letting untreated syphilis run wild in the bloodstream. When you look at the symptoms of the final stage, the paranoia, the erratic outbursts, the delusions, it was all too easy for the public to just shrug and call it the madness of a genius. Modern neurologists analysing these cold cases confirm that the disease was the ultimate silent assassin, perfectly disguising itself behind the quirks of the famous. They were rotting from the inside out right in front of us, but their deterioration was misdiagnosed as alcoholism, drug abuse, or simply the heavy price one pays for being brilliant. And honestly, the most gut-wrenching part of this whole narrative is simply the tragic timing of it all. So many of these legends caught the bug during an era when treatments were technically available, but the social suicide of admitting you had the pox prevented them from seeking help. All the gold, fame and glory in the world could not protect them from a tiny bacterial infection that we can now wipe out with a simple, cheap course of antibiotics from the corner drugstore. Biographers looking back find it to be a brutally ironic twist of fate, a cruel joke played on the powerful. The people who literally shifted the course of culture, art and business weren't taken down by worthy rivals, but by a microscopic organism that modern medicine has rendered almost completely harmless. Let's pull back the curtain on 6 of these remarkable figures to reveal how the disease once known as the Great Imitator operated in the shadows. It stole the minds of history's greatest geniuses while hiding behind a thick veil of secrecy and denial. Even now, in 2026, the cover-up is so deep that some of these families are still fighting to keep the truth buried. He famously bragged about rolling into Chicago with barely $40 in his pocket, swearing he was just a family man devoted to his wife and 12-year-old son. We are talking about the one and only Al Capone, the gangster kingpin, who was brought to his knees not by the police but by an invisible enemy. Capone wasn't just a thug. He was a corporate genius of crime building, the most notorious syndicate in American history through a mix of ruthless violence and sharp strategy. When he was on top of the world, he had the Windy City in a chokehold, raking in cash from bootlegging prostitution and gambling that totaled an estimated $100 million a year. If you adjust that massive fortune for inflation, you are looking at over $1.5 billion in today's money. Totally untouchable wealth. The feds were absolutely powerless to stop him famously having to settle for tax fraud charges because they couldn't make a single murder indictment stick to the Teflon Don. But the force that finally broke the toughest man in America wasn't the law, a rival gang, or even a prison cell. It was the advanced brain-eating stages of syphilis that he likely picked up during his wild years as a young man. Most movies and history books cut to black when he gets locked up at Alcatraz, pretending that was the end of the Al Capone story. But the real horror show started after his release, when neurosyphilis had so thoroughly destroyed his mind that he was a shell of his former self. The guy who once outsmarted the entire US government was reduced to the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child. Looking at the medical charts, it seems almost certain he contracted the infection as a teenager or in his early 20s. Chances are high he picked it up while working as a bouncer in the rough-and-tumble brothels at the start of his career. Like every other tough guy back then, he either got bad medical advice or just ignored the initial sores, allowing the disease to set up camp in his system and wait decades to strike. The shocking diagnosis only officially came to light while he was serving time at Alcatraz in the 1930s. This bombshell was uncovered by a medical researcher who spent years combing through the old prison infirmary logs. The prison doctors documented clearly that he was showing signs of paresis, which is the fancy medical term for the brain damage caused by late-stage syphilis. They tried to treat him, but it was essentially too little too late to reverse the catastrophic damage that had already been done to his brain tissue. By the time they kicked him out of prison in 1939, purely because his health was failing, his cognitive abilities were in free fall. The man who used to command a criminal empire with military-grade precision could no longer do simple math or even hold a basic conversation without getting lost. That legendary temper of his, which he used to deploy like a strategic weapon to terrify his enemies, was gone. It had morphed into bizarre, unpredictable emotional outbursts that terrified his family for all the wrong reasons. By 1945, insiders say he was living in a total fantasy world. He would sit by his swimming pool with a fishing rod, utterly convinced he was reeling in massive catches. He spent his final days chattering away to people who weren't there, lost in the fog of his own decaying mind. By the end, the mental decay was absolute and permanent, leaving nothing of the man he once was. On January 25th, 1947, Capone breathed his last at his Palm Island estate down in Florida. If you looked at the official death certificate, it listed the cause of passing as a stroke complicated by pneumonia. However, the dark truth was that the underlying condition reducing America's most terrifying gangster to a confused childlike state was neurosyphilis, the terminal stage of an infection that had been silently eating away at his brain for decades. What makes Capone's demise particularly tragic from a modern medical perspective is the heartbreaking fact that penicillin had already been discovered. By the mid-1940s, this miracle drug was actively being used to treat syphilis, a detail that medical historians often point out with a sense of bitter irony. If he had simply contracted the disease just 10 or 20 years later, a routine round of antibiotics could have stopped the infection cold, preventing the horrific mental collapse entirely. Instead, it is wild to consider that one of history's most notorious criminal masterminds was defeated not by the FBI or the justice system, but by a common bacterial infection that is easily treatable today. While Capone's slow mental disintegration happened largely behind the closed doors of his mansion, our next legend's downfall played out in the tabloids, becoming the subject of wild gossip and speculation that people are still obsessing over to this day. We are diving into the strange case of a billionaire whose bizarre and eccentric behaviour likely had a medical explanation that nobody around him wanted to admit. His stated purpose was to drive progress and bring the world together, but that grand vision eventually fractured into something unrecognisable. Let's talk about Howard Hughes and that terrifyingly thin line where absolute genius collapses into total madness. Hughes was the ultimate embodiment of American ambition on steroids, a billionaire titan of industry, a daredevil aviator, a Hollywood power player, and a tech innovator with a mind that never seemed to rest. However, his final chapters paint a disturbing picture of crippling paranoia and obsessive-compulsive rituals, alongside a grotesque physical deterioration that transformed this dashing tycoon into a skeletal hermit hiding from the world. While most official biographies write his decline off as severe psychological disorders, a massive stack of evidence has emerged, suggesting that untreated syphilis was actually the hidden puppet master behind his most insane behaviours and his ultimate bodily failure. According to a neuropsychiatrist who has combed through the billionaire's health history, Hughes' symptoms line up perfectly with the classic roadmap of neurosyphilis. The expert explained that Hughes basically served as a textbook case study for the disease's progression, The skyrocketing paranoia, the repetitive compulsive loops, the refusal to bathe, and the eventual wasting away of his body are all red flags that appear when the disease finally infiltrates the central nervous system. We also have to remember that Hughes's legendary promiscuity during the golden age of Hollywood put him directly in the crosshairs for infection. As the handsome producer behind blockbusters like Hell's Angels and The Outlaw, he was sleeping with a laundry list of actresses and socialites during the 1920s and 30s, an era when the great pox was rampant and often went undiagnosed. A Hollywood historian noted that Hughes's romantic resume reads like a perfect storm for exposure to venereal disease. He was extraordinarily active in the bedroom, racking up partners at a dizzying speed. During a time before antibiotics existed, often mingling with women in the entertainment industry, where infection rates were notoriously high. Statistically speaking, the probability that he was exposed to the bacteria multiple times is virtually 100%. What makes the syphilis theory so compelling is that it finally explains his baffling transformation from a functioning eccentric into a totally incapacitated recluse. While he was always a bit odd, his behaviour went completely off the rails in the 1950s and 1960s. This time frame matches exactly with when untreated syphilis typically advances to its devastating tertiary stage. Biographers who have studied Hughes extensively emphasise just how striking this progression was. Back in the 1930s and 40s, he was certainly unusual, but he was still out there breaking aviation records, closing million-dollar deals, and living large in the public eye. By the time the 1960s rolled around, he was a hostage to his own brain, locking himself away to watch the same movies on a loop for days on end, writing manic multi-page manuals, instructing staff on the precise geometry of opening a fruit can, and screaming if another human came near him. The way his body fell apart in those final years is another smoking gun pointing toward advanced syphilitic infection. When he finally died in 1976, this once robust 6'4" giant had withered away to a horrifying 90 pounds, sporting claw-like fingernails and matted hair, looking like a starvation victim despite his billions. The severe muscle wasting, the total abandonment of basic hygiene, and the extreme self-isolation are all consistent with the phase known as dementia paralytica, as explained by the neuropsychiatrist. The infection essentially eats holes in the frontal lobes, wiping out a person's judgment and self-care instincts while the body rots away. So if Hughes really was suffering from syphilis, the big question remains, why on earth wasn't it treated? Medical historians argue that a unique combination of factors trapped Hughes in a situation where help was impossible. A medical ethicist who analysed the case noted that Hughes had assembled a team of doctors who were essentially highly paid enablers rather than actual healers. These physicians were employees who depended entirely on Hughes for their lavish paychecks, not independent professionals who could speak hard truths. If Hughes refused a blood test because he was terrified of the stigma attached to syphilis, his payroll doctors were unlikely to force the issue. Adding to the nightmare, Hughes's intense reclusiveness meant that no outside specialist could ever get close enough to make a proper assessment. By the bitter end, he had completely walled himself off from the medical establishment, treating doctors like enemies and relaying messages solely through a protective ring of aides to avoid any physical contact. The most gut-wrenching twist in this saga is that if Hughes was indeed harbouring the spirochete of syphilis, his torment was entirely optional and could have been halted. As medical historians note, a simple prescription of antibiotics could have wiped the slate clean if they had only intervened before the damage became permanent. Despite possessing a bank account that could buy nations, he couldn't secure the one thing a cheap dose of penicillin offered a brain unclouded by the ravages of a completely treatable nightmare. But while the Hughes diagnosis is left to whispers and guesswork due to shredded files and sealed archives, our next subject's medical reality was an open secret. It was a tragedy witnessed by many, but aggressively swept under the rug by a Hollywood clan desperate to keep their golden name untarnished by scandal. We are talking about the ultimate screen god, a man whose catastrophic spiral stands as the dark cautionary tale of Tinseltown's golden age. As he famously quipped during his chaotic later years, quote, "I would like to inform you I am now talking into this inverted cuspidor," unquote. Enter John Barrymore, the man known to the world as the great profile and the undisputed king of American stage and screen royalty. He was the total package, blessed with the chiselled looks of a statue, the soul of a Shakespearean poet, and a magnetism that could suck the oxygen out of any room. As the crown jewel of the nation's premier acting dynasty, Barrymore seemed invincible until a creeping shadowy illness reduced the Titan to a trembling caricature of himself. For decades, the public narrative has conveniently pinned the blame on the bottle-citing chronic alcoholism as the sole architect of his ruin. However, modern biographers and medical sleuths are uncovering a darker truth, pointing to neurosyphilis as the puppet master behind the scenes. It wasn't just the drink, it was a biological attack on his nervous system that spurred a terrifyingly fast mental disintegration and put him in the grave by age 60. One film historian who dissected the actor's twilight years noted that the trajectory of his fall simply doesn't match the standard profile of a functioning alcoholic. While nobody denies he drank enough to float a battleship, the sheer velocity of his memory loss suggests something far more sinister was at play. The sudden onset of bizarre antics and rapid physical decay in his final decade screams of organic brain damage rather than simple intoxication. When you look at his resume of vices and the medical charts, the evidence overwhelmingly convicts syphilis as the primary culprit. Let's be honest, Barrymore's legendary libido wrote checks that his immune system eventually had to cash, creating endless chances for exposure. From the gaslight theatres to the glitz of the silver screen, he bedded an endless parade of chorus girls and heiresses in an era when the great pox was rampant and polite society looked the other way. As one pathology expert described it, the actor was living inside a perfect storm of biological hazards without an umbrella. This analysis comes from a specialist in early 20th century epidemiology who has tracked the silent spread of the disease through Hollywood's elite. Barrymore cut his teeth in the bohemian underworld of the 1890s and 1900s, a petri dish where infection rates among artists were skyrocketing. He was an equal opportunity lover, and back then, the cure involved toxic mercury or arsenic treatment so grueling that many chose to simply ignore the symptoms until it was too late. If you overlay Barrymore's career timeline with the clinical stages of the infection, the match is chillingly precise. Despite pickling his liver on a daily basis, he remained razor sharp and at the peak of his powers throughout the Roaring Twenties and the early Depression era. But as the calendar flipped to the late 1930s, the fog rolled in, and he began suffering from memory gaps that were impossible to hide. It got to the point where the man who once recited soliloquies in his sleep couldn't retain a simple sentence for more than a few seconds. The speed of this crash paralysed his friends and colleagues, according to a biographer who spoke with the terrified cast members who witnessed it. In a heartbreakingly short window, he went from the genius who defined Hamlet for a generation to a man who couldn't recall to be or not to be. The studios had to resort to desperate measures, hiring cue men to hide behind the set furniture or whisper dialogue into primitive earpieces just to get a usable take. As the bacteria ravaged his frontal lobe, the great profile's behaviour swung wildly out of control. He would whipsaw between moments of his old brilliant self and long stretches of terrifying vacant confusion. His famous sharp tongue degraded into nonsensical rambling and angry outbursts, making him virtually uninsurable and unemployable by 1941. If you watch those final movies, you're seeing a sanitised version of the truth, notes an archivist who has analysed the raw footage. Sympathetic directors had to treat him like a prop, designing shots that required zero memory from him and shooting around the chaos. They stitched his performance together from second-long clips, yet even with movie magic, the glaze over his eyes betrays the hollowness within. When he finally collapsed and died on May 29th, 1942, the coroner cited liver failure, allowing the tragic drunk narrative to stick. However, forensic experts re-examining the case files are convinced that while the liver gave out, the brain had long been under siege. The specific type of cognitive disintegration he displayed screams neurosyphilis as a major, if not the primary cause of his downfall. A leading neuropsychiatrist explained that the trifecta of personality rewiring, memory erasure, and physical stumbling is the classic signature of the disease. Booze certainly wrecked his internal organs, but alcohol alone rarely deletes a person's intellect so completely and so quickly. It was likely a toxic partnership, with the alcoholism camouflaging the symptoms and accelerating the neurological rot caused by the untreated infection. So if the great profile was indeed a victim of this scourge, why was the diagnosis buried for nearly a century? The silence was calculated. In those days, being a hopeless drunk was a tragedy, but syphilis was a scandal that could destroy the Barrymore dynasty forever. As one film historian noted, the Barrymores weren't just a family of actors. They were the closest thing America had to a royal dynasty in the theatre world. But back in the 1940s, admitting that the brightest star of this prestigious clan had succumbed to a shameful sexually transmitted disease was completely out of the question. It was much safer for the PR machine to blame his downfall on the bottle, since being a tortured alcoholic was seen as a gentleman's vice rather than a scandal. We may never get our hands on the unredacted medical files to know exactly how much syphilis contributed to Barrymore's collapse. But looking at those heartbreaking final years, we see a terrifying example of how easily this condition could mask itself behind more socially acceptable diagnoses. Quietly dismantling a genius mind from the inside out while the studio system worked overtime to keep the dirty secret buried. Then there is the strange case of Paul Muni, an Oscar winner, whose career just seemed to evaporate into thin air. Paul Muni was the gold standard for serious acting in the golden age of Hollywood, a man who took the craft more seriously than anyone else. He was famous for disappearing completely into his roles, transforming like a chameleon in heavy hitters, like Scarface, or his legendary biographical turns in The Story of Louis Pasteur and The Life of Émile Zola. He wasn't interested in being a movie star, he was obsessed with the art of character, and that intensity made him a god among dramatic artists. But right when he was sitting on top of the world, raking in critical acclaim and box office, Cash Mooney started a bizarre retreat into the shadows. It started with strange behaviour, vague physical aches and pains, and eventually led to him totally ghosting the industry that loved him. It was a steep decline that many biographers and historians now suspect was the result of the great imitator, itself untreated syphilis. A film archivist who has spent years analysing Muni's timeline noted that his career hit an unexplained brick wall in the 1940s. He went from being Warner Brothers' golden goose, a guy with enough clout to handpick his own projects and directors, to someone who barely worked through scripts in the trash without reading them and basically vanished from the screen by the early 1950s. What makes the Mooney mystery so juicy for historians are the reports on his health that just don't add up. If you look at the official studio press releases, they blamed rheumatoid arthritis or a bad heart for his disappearance. But people who were actually in the room with him described neurological tics and mental slips that the studio publicists never wanted you to hear about. One historian dug up some dirt from crew members who were on set during Mooney's final few projects, and the stories are concerning. These insiders who saw the legend up close in the 1940s painted a picture of a man who was losing his grip. The man known for photographic memory was suddenly forgetting his lines, which was absolutely shocking for a perfectionist of his calibre. He would flip from flying into a blind rage 1 second to being totally disoriented and confused the next. This wasn't stuff that made the papers, but the Whisper network in Hollywood was definitely buzzing about it behind closed doors. Now, we don't have a smoking gun or a lab report confirming Mooney had syphilis, but the circumstantial evidence is piled pretty high. You have to remember, he cut his teeth in the Yiddish theatre circuit, a rough and tumble world where the infection rate was notoriously high back in the day. And his specific cocktail of symptoms, the joint agony, the brain fog, the heart trouble reads like a textbook case of tertiary syphilis. The problem with diagnosing ghosts like Muni is that the studios were experts at scrubbing medical records clean. As one medical historian explained, destroying the evidence was standard procedure to protect a star's bankability and reputation. So we are left trying to connect the dots between erratic behaviour and physical decline without that final piece of proof. But in Mooney's case, the dots seem to draw a straight line to neurosyphilis, even if we can't say it with 100% certainty. This theory is the only one that really explains why such a massive talent would flame out so spectacularly and so early. Mooney was only 61 when he walked away for good, which is incredibly young for a character actor who didn't need to be an action hero or a heartthrob. The standard history books just kind of shrug at why he spent his last 2 decades in hiding, but the medical theory fills in the blanks. If you look at it through the lens of neurosyphilis, the biographer suggests that his weird final years suddenly make tragic sense. The disease is known for coming and going, which explains why he would try to make a comeback and then suddenly retreat into isolation again. It perfectly explains the severe personality shifts that his close friends whispered about, but were too polite to mention to the press. The truth about Paul Mooney's health is still one of those lingering Hollywood cold cases that keeps researchers up at night. It is a classic example of how the real story was likely buried deep to save the legacy of a man everyone respected. Because back then, getting diagnosed with that specific infection wasn't just an illness, it was a character assassination. Now let's turn to Oscar Wilde, the man whose sharp tongue eventually led to his exile and demise. Oscar Wilde wasn't just a writer, he was a brand, a poet, and the absolute king of conversation in the late Victorian social scene. His stage plays like The Importance of Being Earnest and Lady Windermere's Fan turned witty banter into high art forms. Meanwhile, his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, dove deep into the dark side of vanity and corruption, showing a psychological depth that was way ahead of its time. Imagine a literary icon falling so low that he spent his final years absolutely broke, banished from polite society and rotting away until he kicked the bucket way too soon at just 46 years old. It was a brutal downfall, likely sped up by the ravages of syphilis, a nasty souvenir he probably picked up years before he was thrown behind bars in that notorious scandal. The medical chart of Oscar Wilde is basically a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces, according to experts who have spent years digging into the gritty details of the writer's tragic end. Sure, getting locked up for gross indecency back in 1895 was a nightmare that wrecked his constitution through hard labour and filthy conditions. However, the way his body and mind just totally collapsed after he was released in 1897 screams of a darker underlying issue that matches the late stages of tertiary syphilis. We are not just guessing here. The clues pointing to this venereal nightmare come from all sorts of different places. You have got personal diaries describing his nasty symptoms and detailed notes from the physicians who were desperately trying to patch him up during his final spiral. Plus, just looking at the specific timeline of how he fell apart gives the game away. Once he was a free man again, Wilde started showing a terrifying mix of brain issues and bodily failures that match the textbook definition of neurosyphilis almost perfectly. The poor guy was tormented by agonising ear infections that would not quit, eventually burrowing deep enough to infect the meninges that is the protective layer around your brain and spine. Medical historians who have combed through the records of his deathbed agony point out that this specific type of infection, mixed with him losing his sharp mental edge, is a smoking gun. When you add the physical wasting away to the mix, it points a giant neon arrow toward the meningovascular variety of the disease. So if the legendary playwright was indeed carrying this ticking time bomb, when exactly did the fuse get lit? Those in the know suggest we need to look way back to his wild college days or his roaring 20s, long before he met the toxic Lord Alfred Douglas, who eventually dragged his reputation through the mud. A lot of people wrongly assume that his scandalous relationships with men were the cause of his infection, but that is just lazy gossip. That theory shows a total lack of knowledge about Wilde's actual life story and how this ruthless disease actually operates according to the researchers. Before he was the icon of queer history, Wilde had his fair share of flings with women, and rumour has it he visited plenty of brothels during his university years. It was pretty standard behaviour for guys in the Victorian era, but it was like playing Russian roulette with their health. The most heartbreaking part of this whole saga is that even while his body was rotting away, his sharp tongue and genius sense of humour never missed a beat. Buddies who stopped by his sad little exile spot in Paris said that even though he looked like a shadow of himself, he could still talk circles around anyone right up until the curtains closed. That brilliant brain, which gave us the snappiest one-liners in history, was locked in a brutal war with the sickness that was eating him alive. Legend has it that he cracked one last joke while lying on his deathbed at the cheap Hôtel d'Alsace, proving he was a performer to the end. Glaring at the hideous decor on the walls, he famously quipped that he and the wallpaper were fighting a duel to the death and one of them had to go. Being able to laugh while the Grim Reaper is knocking at the door is exactly why Wilde is still such a fascinating celebrity icon today. His humour was the only shield he had left against the darkness. He finally checked out on November 30th, 1900, and the doctors officially wrote it down as cerebral meningitis. But looking back with modern science, it is almost certain that meningitis was just the curtain call for tertiary syphilis. That nasty bug had likely been silently wrecking his nervous system for decades before it finally finished the job. It is a layered tragedy that hits you from every angle when you really stop to think about it. Here you have a genius crushed by society's hate, but also by a simple bacteria that a shot of penicillin could have cured if he had just been born a little later. It is sickeningly ironic that the guy who wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, a story about a man rotting on the inside while looking fine on the outside, was living that exact nightmare in real life. Losing him so young feels like a robbery. Think of all the masterpieces we never got to see because his time ran out. If only medicine had moved a tiny bit faster, the literary world would look completely different today. All those plays, books and witty comebacks vanished into the ether, never to be enjoyed by the public. They were all stolen by a disease that took down a giant while masquerading as something else entirely on the death certificate. Now let's talk about Edgar Allan Poe, the original Goth King, whose real life was scarier than his fiction. He gave us the creepiest stories about insanity and rot, but he was living his own horror movie. His twisted tales and poems have basically set the blueprint for spooky storytelling for almost 200 years now. But honestly, the way he died is weirder and more unsettling than anything he ever wrote down on paper. His last days were a blur of total madness and confusion, ending tragically when he dropped dead at the incredibly young age of 40. People have blamed everything under the sun for his death, booze rabies, even carbon monoxide leaks, but the truth might be even darker. There is a massive pile of clues suggesting that neurosyphilis was the real villain here, explaining why he went insane and why his final moments were a delirious fever dream. The death of Poe is like the ultimate cold case file of American history. Historians who obsess over 19th century writers still argue about the details over drinks to this day. Picture this! It is October 1849 and Poe is found wandering the streets of Baltimore completely out of his mind, wearing cheap clothes that definitely did not belong to him, with zero clue how he got there. He spent 4 days seeing things that weren't there, totally confused and screaming for a mysterious guy named Reynolds that nobody knew, before finally dying without ever explaining what the hell happened. And when you look at the medical receipts, the evidence starts to paint a very specific picture. The theory that Edgar Allan Poe was rotting from the inside out due to a syphilis infection isn't just wild gossip. The circumstantial evidence builds a terrifyingly solid case. If you look closely at the wretched symptoms he suffered during his final hours in Baltimore, the hallucinations, the utter confusion, and the racing heart rate, they paint a textbook picture of the neurological crisis seen in late-stage infection. But it wasn't just the end. For years leading up to his death, people watched him unravel, dealing with wild mood swings, severe memory gaps, and emotional meltdowns that seemed to come out of nowhere. When you strip away the Gothic romance and view Poe's life through a modern medical chart, you see a clear downward spiral of a man losing his mental faculties piece by piece. According to top-tier neurologists who have spent time digging into these historical cold cases, that specific kind of mental decay is highly consistent with neurosyphilis. You have a man who suddenly couldn't handle a drop of liquor, who would get lost in familiar places, and who flipped from happy to enraged in a split second. That is not the behaviour of a garden variety drunk. That is the signature of physical brain damage causing absolute chaos in the nervous system. So when did the author of The Raven catch the bug? Most historians place their bets on his wilder days at the University of Virginia or his brief stint in the Army Classic hotspots for bad decisions. You have to remember, back in the early 19th century, urban centres were crawling with infection. Roughly 1 in 10 people in the city were carrying the bacteria. As one medical historian pointed out, you have a young, broke poet moving through crowded campuses and military barracks, effectively placing himself in the perfect breeding ground for catching a venereal disease during his most reckless years. And that is the scary part. This killer can sleep in your system for decades, totally silent, before it wakes up and starts attacking the brain, which is exactly what seems to have happened to Poe. This theory actually solves the biggest riddle of his final years and gives us the smoking gun regarding his bizarre relationship with alcohol. We all have this image of Poe swigging whiskey as a habitual drunkard. But witnesses from the time swore that he actually had zero tolerance for it. A single glass of wine was reportedly enough to knock him out or make him act completely insane. That extreme reaction that hypersensitivity isn't a quirk, it is a documented side effect of the infection ravaging the nervous system. Medical experts explain that the disease inflames and damages the brain's blood vessels, meaning even a tiny amount of alcohol hits the compromised system like a sledgehammer. To a bartender or a friend, he looks like a wasted drunk, but in reality, he is likely a syphilis patient, suffering a catastrophic neurological reaction to a relatively small amount of drink. When he finally died, the official certificate listed phrenitis or congestion of the brain, a diagnosis that scientifically fits the profile of meningovascular syphilis perfectly. But let's be real, back then, the stigma was so intense that doctors almost never wrote venereal disease on the paperwork. They listed the immediate symptom to avoid scandal. They would cite the swelling or the fever rather than the shameful underlying condition that caused it. As historians note, 19th century death certificates were often more about social discretion and being polite than about being medically accurate. Calling it brain fever instead of the pox was the standard move to protect the legacy and reputation of a famous public figure like Poe. There is a dark, twisted irony here that the undisputed king of American Gothic horror might have been killed by the very same madness he became famous for writing about, a fact that scholars find incredibly haunting. Think about his characters. They are constantly hearing beating hearts, seeing things that aren't there, and losing their grip on reality through paranoia. Those aren't just creative choices. Those are the precise clinical symptoms of tertiary syphilis eating away at the mind. There is a very real possibility that masterpieces like The Telltale Heart and The Fall of the House of Usher were essentially diary entries of his own neurological breakdown, according to literary experts. He could write about insanity so vividly because he was likely terrified watching the early stages of this infection take over his own brain, providing the raw material for the stories that would outlive him. While we can't dig him up and prove it 100%, the medical breadcrumbs leave us with the most logical answer to one of the biggest mysteries in literature, suggesting syphilis was the true culprit. It is a heartbreaking realization that some of the greatest art we have came from men silently fighting a war against their own deteriorating nervous systems. This bacteria didn't just kill people. It fundamentally altered the course of human history. Poe isn't alone. Look at Al Capone, Howard Hughes, John Barrymore, Paul Muni and Oscar Wilde. They are just the tip of the iceberg in a long list of legends taken down by this scourge. These were titans of industry and art whose entire lives and legacies were warped by a condition that in the modern world we fix with a cheap round of antibiotics from the corner drugstore. When you look back through the medical lens, you have to ask, was it artistic genius, was it madness, or was it just an untreated infection? How many so-called eccentric geniuses were actually suffering from massive brain damage? How many famous alcoholics were actually just self-medicating a much scarier undiagnosed condition? The implications change everything, and the saddest part of these stories is simply the bad luck of the timing. Every one of these icons lived in a time when there was either no cure or the cure was so shameful and toxic that people preferred to die in secret. If they had been born just a few decades later into the age of penicillin, we wouldn't be talking about their tragic declines at all. The eventual discovery of... Back in the 1940s, the arrival of penicillin wasn't just a science breakthrough. It was like a magic wand waving over a horror show, and a leading neurologist noted that this wonder drug completely flipped the script on one of the nastiest afflictions known to man. It essentially performed a miracle, transforming a terrifying death sentence, a slow, agonising rot that ate you from the inside out, into a minor inconvenience that could be wiped away with just a couple of quick jabs of a needle. History actually has a jagged scar running right through the middle of the 20th century, because before that miracle mould came along, the Great Pox didn't just make people sick, it absolutely obliterated their entire existence. But once we crossed that line into the antibiotic age, that monster under the bed shrank down into something you could easily manage with a simple visit to the clinic and a prescription pad. Tragically, this life-saving revolution arrived just a heartbeat too late for the famous faces we are talking about today, as every single one of them endured a slow, painful demise from a condition that in 2026, doctors would just zap without breaking a sweat. Their tragic final chapters stand as grim monuments, reminding us not only of how far science has come, but also of the brutal price paid for silence, since the shame attached to this diagnosis was often more dangerous than the germs themselves. One public health historian didn't mince words, observing that the hush-hush culture and deep-seated shame swirling around the illness were likely just as lethal to the patient as the actual infection ever was. Because society didn't view it as a random medical bad break, but rather as a moral failing and a dirty mark of sin directly tied to what you were doing between the sheets, the stigma was crushing. Consequently, countless people chose to suffer in the shadows rather than walk into a doctor's office terrified of being found out and skipping treatments, even when life-saving help was sitting right there on the shelf. It is heartbreaking to realise that the cultural stigma was a literal killer, claiming the lives of men and women who could have easily been saved if they hadn't been so paralysed by the fear of a ruined reputation. And the cover-up didn't stop when their hearts stopped beating. That stain of disgrace reached out from the grave to twist the narrative and control exactly how their life stories were written for future generations. You had entire teams, families, official biographers, and big studios working overtime to scrub the record clean, spinning fairy tales that blamed a star's collapse on exhaustion or the bottle. Because being a drunk was socially acceptable, but having the pox was not. Back in the day, there was this silent pact among the people writing history books where they all agreed that some dirty laundry was just too filthy to ever be aired out in public, no matter what the truth actually was. A literary scholar who spent years digging through these medical cover-ups explained the mechanics of the lie, noting that it wasn't accidental, but a calculated move to shape how we remember our cultural idols. But make no mistake, this went way deeper than just trying to save face for a dead celebrity or protect a wealthy family name from the tabloids and gossip columnists. It came from a real, albeit twisted, belief that true genius and legendary achievements shouldn't be smeared with the grime of such a shameful and biological reality, effectively putting these figures on a pedestal they never asked for. Consequently, we are left with a massive pile of medical misinformation, meaning that even today, if you pick up a biography, you might be reading a sanitised fiction rather than the cold, hard facts of their life. Thankfully, as we move through the 2020s, modern medicine has tamed the beast and our social attitudes have finally loosened up enough for us to talk about it without blushing or whispering. Now, a new wave of historians and medical sleuths are dusting off the old files, tackling the messy job of re-examining these famous figures to figure out if their downfall was actually caused by the secret sickness everyone ignored. But let's be clear, this isn't just some academic exercise in fact-checking or fixing a few footnotes in a history book for the sake of accuracy. It is about coming to grips with the massive toll this scourge took on our world, understanding that it secretly steered the course of art, culture, and even global politics in ways that we are only just starting to wrap our heads around. As one biographer mused, when you actually tally up the sheer number of geniuses who were taken out early by this infection, you are forced to face one of the most haunting what-if scenarios in all of history. Just imagine the masterpieces Oscar Wilde might have penned if he had been given another 20 years of life instead of withering away in a hotel room in Paris. Think about the groundbreaking technologies Howard Hughes could have invented if his brain hadn't been clouded by madness, or the gut-wrenching performances John Barrymore might have delivered on the silver screen. When you add it all up, the cultural treasure we lost to this, silence is simply too massive to measure, leaving a hole in our artistic heritage that can never be filled.